Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Coffee and Invasive Species this morning. We're so excited to have you joining us. The Allen County, Indiana Soil and Water Conservation District is presenting it this morning with the help of our partners, NRCS. My name's Joelle Neff. I know usually it's Mike Whirling who's moderating these, but Mike is doing other things for the district this morning. So you're stuck with me, but I'm a watershed project manager with Allen County Soil and Water. And I'm so pleased and grateful to be with you this morning. We are recording this and it will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel. If anyone's interested in watching it again later, or if you're interested in sharing it with your friends who weren't able to attend. Please have your audio on mute unless you're asking a question or you have a comment, in which case you are more than welcome to unmute yourself. And you can also use the chat because that will be monitored. And you can use that if you have any questions. This morning we have Arthur Franke, who is the NRCS District Conservationist in Steuben County, Indiana. And he will be talking about invasive species, particularly plants, and management strategies as well as identification. So, Art, please take it away. We're so excited to hear what you have to say.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Joelle. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. If not, Joelle, I guess send me a message through the chat and I'll try to fix the audio. But
I can hear you great.
Great. So we'll go ahead and get started. Like Joelle said, the invasive species are the topic we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to do a quick introduction of what invasive species are. We'll watch a quick video, an educational video done by Steuben Soil and Water Conservation District. It's a fun video. It's educational. I think everybody will like it. And then we'll go into some of the common invasive species that we deal with here in Indiana on ag land, in forestry, and in wildlife habitat and landscaping. And then we'll wrap it up with control methods and ways to combat invasive species, and then resources that landowners can go to for help with identification, with control, with possible money to help get rid of invasive species. And then we'll probably do questions and answers at the end. So to start it off, invasive species are something we've been dealing with for a long time. Different species come and go as a problem. Animals can be invasive species, insects, diseases, plants. Plants are probably what we're going to focus on the most here today. Because that's what I'm most familiar with, and a lot of our conservation programs can help deal with invasive plants. But there are invasive animals. An example would be wild hogs in the southern United States, causing lots of damage, destruction, damage to trees and crops. Insects can be invasive. An example recently that we've dealt with here in Indiana is the emerald ash borer. Attacks ash trees, which were one of the valuable components of our hardwood forests, and pretty much decimated our ash population here in Indiana. An example of a disease, chestnut blight, affected American chestnut trees in the eastern United States in the early 1900s. Very similar to emerald ash borer, except that I believe is a virus. It decimated the American chestnut population, which was a very valuable component of the forests farther east of here. And that species has never really recovered in its native range. So the plants we're going to talk about a lot today that we deal with are not from here. They do not come from Indiana. They come from other parts of the world. Oftentimes the invasive species that we deal with come from Europe or Central East Asia. Climate's very similar to ours here in the Midwest, with a cold winter dormant season and a growing season. They have no natural control here, no predators, nothing really eats them. and they just can grow out of control and outcompete the native plant communities. So to kick this off, I'm going to go to the next screen here, and we are going to watch a quick video. And as this starts, let me know if it's coming through okay.
Hey! 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 Oh, hey there. Hey, did you see an invasive species around here? Okay, well, I'll take it from your lack of response. You may not know what an invasive species is. Not to worry. My name is John Brittenham. I work for Blue Heron Ministries, and today I'm here to tell you about invasive species. Well, the first thing that you need to know is that an invasive species is an organism, a plant, an animal, or a microorganism with three main traits. The first one is they're not from around here. They came from some other area of the world, and they're brought usually by human means. They're often referred to as non-native, but they can also be called introduced, exotic, or alien species. Second, they cause harm. This is usually harm to the environment, but they can also cause harm to humans, or they can cause harm to the economy. Third, they are very effective at spreading throughout their environment. They generally spread very quickly in a habitat compared to other similar species, and they are very, very successful reproducing and expanding throughout the habitat. Let's take an example of an oddity that has been discovered in the Wabash River in Indiana. There are these crazy jumping fish from China called Asian carp that were introduced into the United States and then migrated to the Mississippi River system to the Wabash River. Because these Asian carp now call this Indiana River their home, they have outcompeted and pushed out the other native species by consuming the resources these native species rely on. Invasive species are like a sickness to the environment. Imagine the environment is like the human body. Our bodies must stay healthy and balanced in order to maintain health. For this reason, the body has to stay the right temperature, have the right level of chemicals, have enough water to be able to fight off diseases, and things like that. The environment also has to stay in balance in order to be healthy. So if an invasive species comes in and causes the ecosystem to be out of balance, then the environment begins to become unhealthy. One of the main ways invasive species make the environment unhealthy is by displacing native organisms. This decreases the amount of biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is simply the diversity or number of plants, animals, and other organisms in the area. Biodiversity is the most important indicator of the health for an ecosystem. Invasive species are invasive because they can dominate native species. They didn't evolve with the native plants and animals, and therefore they have advantages over the native species in the area. They also don't have natural predators and diseases that would otherwise keep them in check. Now, not all species that are introduced to a new area become invasive. In fact, the majority don't, but those that can cause some major problems. Now let's talk about an invasive species that you can find right here in this wetland. It's all around us here. It is one of the worst invasive species in northern Indiana. I'm talking about the invasive cattail. Did you even know that cattails were an invasive species? Cattails have not always been invasive. The broadleaf cattail was native to northern Indiana, and it coexisted in balance with the other species around it. Then, around 100 to 150 years ago, a narrowleaf cattail was introduced to Indiana and the surrounding states. The two species hybridized, or combined, to form a new type of plant. The new hybrid cattail became the problem. This new hybrid cattail is very aggressive and well suited to outcompete and displace most of the native wetland plants around it. Cattails began to take over many of the wetlands in northeast Indiana and now are considered to be one of the biggest threats to the health of our wetland ecosystems. Take this area for example. We see cattails all around us now. They would have started though in one spot and then slowly expanded year after year, increasing in size, just like cancer does in the human body. Today, they completely dominate the wetland all around us. We would call this area of cattails a monoculture, or a population of plants that consists mainly of a single plant species. Consider the wildlife that may reside here or in other wetlands. Very few native wildlife species consume or live among cattails, and as a result, many of the wildlife species that once lived in this wetland can no longer survive here today. Because cattails are so successful, many local wetlands are dominated by them and other non-native invasive species, like the reed canary grass that we see right in front of us here. This means that it's getting harder and harder for the plants and animals that once lived in these healthy wetlands to find a home. In other landscapes in Indiana, plants such as autumn olive, Callery pear, garlic mustard, and Multiflora rose cause problems as well. These plants are spreading very rapidly, choking out native plants and changing things. If you have any of these on your property, they should be controlled by removing them or killing them to prevent further spread. Once the invasive species have been removed, it is possible to restore the habitat to a healthy, natural landscape. Take this site, for example. 8 years ago, this wetland was not healthy at all. It was covered with invasive species, and they were getting worse and worse every year. But then a large-scale ecological restoration project was started. Ecological restoration is the process of returning an ecosystem and its habitats back to a state of health by restoring as much of the area's biodiversity as possible. Since then, the invasive species in the area have been controlled, and many of the plants that were here historically have been replanted and are thriving once again. In turn, many of the threatened and endangered animals also reside in this habitat again. It was a reminder that if we put money and time and our energy into restoring these landscapes, we can turn them to a state of beauty, diversity, and health that sustains this great planet that we call home. There's an invasive species behind me right now, isn't there? Well, it just goes to show that the work of controlling invasive species is never done. Looks like I'm off to get that guy. Talk to you later. Hey! Hey! Get back here!
Okay, a special thank you to John Brittenham from Blue Heron Ministries, Tammy Mosier, Purdue Extension, Steuben County, and Amy Wentworth, Steuben County Soil and Water Conservation District for that video. Hope you enjoyed it. A little bit of fun, but also very educational. So now we're going to jump into the different categories of invasive species. I've sort of categorized them as to what habitat type you might find them in, but really you can find some of these invasive species anywhere. First one I'm going to focus on is agriculture. We've been dealing with invasive species in agriculture forever, basically, commonly just called weeds. The difference being that some of the weeds we deal with are native to the area, and some of the weeds we deal with are not native to the area and are pretty aggressive and therefore invasive. An example of one that has been a recent problem, been in the news, Palmer amaranth, annual amaranth species, I believe from the southern Great Plains area, not native to Indiana or the Midwest. Is coming into the area, affecting corn and soybean yields on cropland. the plants can get humongous, 6 feet plus tall. One plant can produce millions of seeds. Those seeds are tiny. They can spread throughout a crop field very quickly. The plant is showing signs of herbicide resistance to a lot of the common herbicides that farmers use to combat weeds. It's just a major problem, negatively affecting crop yields. It is known to be in many parts of Indiana, and it's something we need to keep an eye on. If you find this plant in your field, it's worth the time and effort to actually walk your fields, pull them out. If you let them get too big, you may need to take a machete out there and cut them down, because you do not want this to get established in your fields. Canada thistle, another one that's been around for a long time, perennial, goes to seed, flower and seed in the summertime. Those nice pink pretty flowers will soon turn into balls of seed fluff that's going to fly everywhere, and spread the Canada thistle. It's also called creeping thistle because even if you mow it, its root system is going to stay alive and it's going to spread. It can take multiple applications of herbicide to finally kill a colony of Canada thistle. The roots can go many feet deep into the soil. They can spread many feet horizontally within one growing season, and send up new plant starts several feet away. A big problem, especially in pastures and hayland production, because it's very prickly. Animals are not going to want to eat it. Just having a couple Canada thistle plants in a cutting of hay can really reduce the quality of that hay. So these are just two examples of the invasive species that you're going to find in the agriculture world. There's lots more examples, and if anybody wants to talk about examples in particular, we'll save that for the questions and answers at the end. We're going to go to invasive species in forestry. There's a lot of shrubby species that we deal with in forestry that tend to grow in the understory of the forest. At first glance, they may not seem to be much of a problem, but if given time, some of these species, such as invasive honeysuckle, multiflora rose, autumn olive, will basically outcompete our native oaks, hickories, maples. They're not much of a threat to mature trees, but it's the small trees in the understory, the seedlings that are trying to grow, that honeysuckle, for example, can cast so dense of a shade that an oak's seedling just cannot get going. And that's going to be a major problem down the road, because we rely on our native trees for the wildlife habitat they provide. We rely on our native trees for the timber that they can provide and the income that they can provide to our forest owners. And if we're not having good regeneration of our walnuts, oaks, hickories, maples, that's going to be bad news for our forest lands in the future. These are often perennial. They can spread by seed, and they're often pretty shade tolerant, so they can grow even in the understory of an established woodlands. And again, those are just a couple of the examples of invasive species that we deal with in forestry. There are many more examples, and we can bring those up in the questions and answers also. Invasive species in our native wildlife habitats. These are often also invasive species that you may deal with in landscaping around homes or businesses. Autumn olive has been around for quite a couple decades, proven to be a pretty invasive plant. The root system, I believe, fixes its own nitrogen, so it can grow in pretty low quality soil. It has a lot of flowers every year when it gets to a certain age. The flowers do look pretty and they smell good, but the plant that produces thousands of berries potentially per plant, spreading seed all around, and each of those seeds have the chance to turn into another autumn olive. And it outcompetes I see it outcompeting prairie grasses and native wildflowers and CRP fields. It can sneak into tree plantings when trees are young, outcompete the native trees that are planted. it can be a pretty major problem. The invasive honeysuckle species, of which there are several varieties and species, including Tarshan honeysuckle and Japanese honeysuckle, which is more vining. They often are the first thing to green up in the spring and one of the last things to lose their leaves in the fall. They have a very long growing season. They cast very dense shade underneath them. And if they can get a foothold, they're also going to spread by their root system, and they're going to spread by the red berries that they produce. Again, I've seen honeysuckle become very thick underneath trees, outcompete native seedlings. It often likes partial shade, but I've seen it out in the open, and it eventually will work its way into a woods where there is pretty dense shade. So the problem here is that these invasives are taking up space, soil space, sunlight, water, and nutrients away from the native trees or plants that are trying to grow, not giving them a chance. And eventually they can produce what we call a monoculture of plants where there's only one species growing, such as honeysuckle, where previously maybe there was a nice community of 10 plus woody native trees and shrubs. So again, many other examples of invasive species in our native wildlife habitats, but these are just two examples. A third example, which I don't have a picture of here, but there was in the video, calorie pear. As recently as 10 years ago, I believe calorie pear was not known to be much of an issue invasive wise. Commonly planted as a landscaping tree under the name Bradford or some other variety names, Bradford pear being one. The plants were supposedly sterile. The rootstock they were grafted onto was not. And the calorie pear species are just spreading like crazy, especially in areas around Fort Wayne. I've seen calorie pear and CRP fields starting to get established up in Steuben County. I know it's really bad in the southern part of the state. It has pretty white flowers early in the spring, and little tiny hard pears that mature through the summer, and it can spread by its root system. It can spread by those pears getting spread around by birds, and that may be our statewide the number one up and coming concern of invasive species. It is really aggressive. So now we're going to go into control of invasive species. A lot of thought and planning needs to go into control of invasive species. There's chemical options such as herbicides. There's cultural options. An example of a cultural option would be maybe you've got a forest that's got quite a bit of sunlight getting down to the forest floor, and you've got some autumn olive spreading or starting to get established. If you can cut that back and get canopy closure within a couple years of your native trees in the overstory, autumn olive is one of the invasives that can't really compete in shade. It can do light shade, but it cannot do total shade. So in that case, if you get your forest to have canopy closure and not as much sunlight hitting the forest floor, you can control autumn olive. Now that cultural control method is not going to work for something like honeysuckle, which can tolerate the more dense shade. So in that case, you're going to have to go to more of a chemical or a mechanical option. Mechanical option is exactly that. It can be cutting something down with a chainsaw, one of these big Fecon mowers mounted on a skid loader or a bobcat. There's a picture of one there. Those can chew through dense stands of invasive shrubs very easily. Downside being, there's a lot of equipment and time and expense there wrapped up into that. Mechanical control oftentimes by itself is not going to do the job unless you do mechanical control for multiple years in a row. So it's recommended to do a mechanical control along with a chemical control to kill the root system, because a lot of these invasives are perennial. Simply killing the plant above ground is not going to eradicate it. Another basic mechanical control option there, the picture of the people pulling weeds in a garden, I believe. The same thing. If invasives are small enough and you can actually pull them out of the ground, that's over time, that's going to work. If you stop them from going to seed, you reduce their population. Garlic mustard is one of the herbaceous invasives that we find in forests. This method works pretty well for garlic mustard, as long as the population is not too high, because they are easy to pull out of the ground. And then finally, there's biological control options. These are not as commonly used, but they can be effective. It's basically bringing a species in that attacks invasive species. So it might be a disease from where that invasive species is natively from. You bring that disease in and release it, and it starts over time to bring the population of the invasives down. This one is probably the most controversial because you bring another organism into our native environment. It may attack the invasive that you want it to, but it also may attack other things that we didn't think about. So this one is not as commonly used, but there have been successful biological control options for invasives. It's important to note what species you're dealing with, because a lot of the invasives have different growth cycles. They have a vulnerable phase of their growth where an herbicide or a control method is going to be the most effective. And for the sake of time and money, it's often very important to hit that invasive with your control option during its vulnerable phase. An example of this would be, let's take autumn olive, for example. During the fall, when it starts to go dormant, so about this time of year, sap is running from the upper reaches of the plant that are above ground down into the root system to store energy for the winter. At that point, if the plant is cut and an herbicide is applied immediately, that moving sap that's taking the energy reserves down into the roots is going to carry that herbicide more effectively with it down into all the reaches of the root system, hopefully killing the entire root system of the autumn olive. If that same thing would be done in the spring when the sap is pushing upwards, some herbicide may find its way down into the root system, but not all of it. Most of that is going to get pushed out of the ground by the pressure of the moving sap, and it's just not going to be as effective. So in the case of a lot of the invasive shrubs, control in the fall is typically much more effective and recommended. And then even if you follow all the control methods and the effective timing, repeated control for several years is probably going to be needed on a lot of these invasive species to help deplete the root energy reserves. And also because in an established population of invasive species, there's going to be seed banks present of seed that plant has produced over the last couple years. And you're probably going to have some of that resprout and start growing again as new little plants once you remove the bigger invasives. So definitely once a year of control is done, monitoring is needed. Come back and check on the site. Probably plan for a follow-up application or maybe two. Oftentimes that is needed. There's a lot of resources available to help landowners, to help people that are combating invasive species. Non-exhaustive lists, your USDA Service Center, talk to NRCS, talk to your county SWCD, Purdue Extension agents and educators, the state of Indiana Control of Invasives organization SICM has a very helpful website. I'm going to show you some of the things on that here soon. There's a control chart on there of the invasive species that are common in Indiana. They've got a calendar there and the most effective dates to go after those invasives, to do control, and then the recommended control type that's going to be best to combat that invasive species. So I guess the takeaway from that is that you can't treat all invasives the same. They're different species. You've got to know your target. You got to target control methods to that invasive, and it'll be much more effective in the long run and a better use of your time, effort, and money. So with that, let's go to the SICM website here. I want to show you a couple of things on there. So this is the State of Indiana Cooperative Invasives Management Landowner Toolkit. There's the website link, and it's also available on the PowerPoint if anybody wants it. This is a very useful site to send to anybody that has questions about invasives. There's a guide to the regulated terrestrial invasive plant species of Indiana. This list includes the species that are legally. It is illegal to transport, sell, plant a lot of these invasives, and they're on this list if you want to check that out. They've got a plant list listed by growth form and their common names. There's brochures here about invasives. You may find some of these in your USDA office or at Purdue Extension. And then there's fact sheets about if you're wanting to know more about a specific plant. Let's say you're dealing with common reed, also known as Phragmites, in a wetland or a pond. You can click on this fact sheet, and it's going to load a page, and you can read all about Phragmites, the control methods, the description of it, the problem, where it's from. A lot of good information on there. You go further down, there's publications by Purdue. They have these featured invasive plant series. Same thing, you could click on one of these if I wanted to know more about burning bush, an invasive shrub that we're seeing more and more in woodlands. I would click on this link, and it's going to open an information page for winged burning bush for me, usually complete with some pictures and identification help. To help you figure out if that's what you've really got. And then further down, I like this. There's a recommended Indiana native plants, alternatives to invasives. So instead of planting a calorie pear, you can click on this, and it's going to pull up some information on some of the native alternatives. Flowery dogwood, redbud, serviceberry are all similar sized trees. They have similar growth pattern, but they're not invasive. They're native, and they're going to be a lot better for the native wildlife. Which, talking about that, that's in a forestry setting, in a wildlife habitat setting, in a landscaping setting. Once you do have control done, once that invasive is at a tolerable level, you don't see it spreading, you don't have a problem with it anymore, you're pretty sure you've got it eradicated from your area, it's best to get something native growing there, to take up that soil space, to produce shade, to take up soil and water and nutrients, and make sure that the invasives don't have a spot to get back to and start growing again. So yeah, if you have more questions, definitely check out this SICM website. Very useful. I use it quite a bit. And then there's also a reference here for the financial assistance for invasive species control. This is where NRCS sort of comes in. We're always happy to help landowners identify invasives, but often what people are interested in is help to get those invasives gone. So there's the NRCS financial assistance programs. EQIP is one of those. Through EQIP, our brush management practice can help pay for the elimination of a lot of the invasive species in woods. Honeysuckle, autumn olive, multiflora rose. We can pay for up to 3 years of control to get those invasives out of your woods. And the same thing in an open habitat. 315 would be herbaceous weed control. That's control of herbaceous invasives. We can help pay for spraying or mowing potentially to get rid of those invasive species. So all of that's on this website. Very useful. Check it out. We'll go back to the presentation here. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. Questions about invasives in general, questions about specific invasives. Let's see if we got any questions from the attendees here.
You all are more than welcome to unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat if you have any questions.
And if we don't have any questions at this time, I do have part of another presentation I can go into where I get into a little more detail about the NRCS programs.
We do have some questions coming in. So Cheryl asked how to control greenbrier vine.
Okay, greenbrier is not one I'm real familiar with. I know what it is. I think that species is actually native, the greenbrier species. It can be a problem in the woods. It can wrap its way up young trees, stunt their growth, even kill them. I would assume it would be recommended, because it's a perennial, to cut the vines at the soil line and treat with some kind of herbicide. I would guess a glyphosate or a 2,4-D product of some kind. While we're talking about that, herbicides can be a very useful tool in invasives control. There have been reported problems with herbicides, especially those containing 2,4-D products, Tordon and Crossbow, and I think some others, can affect some of the natives, especially tulip tree. If invasives are controlled near even a mature tulip tree, that herbicide can get into their soil and actually kill nearby tulip trees. So that's something to be aware of. If you're working in the woods that's got tulip trees that you do not want to affect, that'd be something I would caution about. But yeah, greenbrier, I have seen it be a problem. It is native, so it's technically not invasive, but it is aggressive. And that's the case with some other plants. Canada goldenrod comes to mind. There are some plants out there that are pretty aggressive, can outcompete other natives, but they are native themselves, so they're not considered invasive, they're just aggressive. So greenbrier, that would be my advice. Cut the vines at the soil line, treat with an herbicide, and just keep an eye on it.
Okay, we have another question from Beth asking, when will calorie pair be regulated?
Okay, very good question. Calorie pair is one that is specifically not on the state list. I know there's been push to get that into legislation, that calorie pair is regulated. So far that has not happened. You can still go to big box stores or nurseries and buy calorie pair and plant it. At this point, all we can do is continue to educate people that that's not the greatest choice. Calorie pair has a lot of drawbacks. Yes, it's pretty in the spring and in the fall when its leaves turn colors, but its wood is very brittle. It tends to snap off in ice storms and wind. It's not to mention the fact that it's very invasive, but yeah, at this point it's not regulated, and I don't know if anybody has any idea when that will happen or if that will happen. So yeah, good question, but calorie pair is still unregulated.
Okay, Mariah asked, is there a temperature that's too cold for treating woody species via Cut Stump. She works for the Little River Wetlands Project, and they're planning to add alcohol to their herbicide for their weed wrangle this Saturday. But will there be less uptake with it being cold?
Okay, good question. And I see Nellie's got a response there about doing Cut Stump on honeysuckle in the snow and had good success down into the 30s. Most of the herbicides can have an effect to freezing and a little bit below. I think I've heard the cutoff of about 20 degrees. If you cut, let's say a honeysuckle, for example, and you put herbicide on within, I can't think, a couple minutes is recommended. Within a couple minutes of freshly cutting a live plant, it can start to seal over. And so it's best to apply that herbicide as soon as possible, as soon as it's cut. And I've always heard that down into about 20 degrees Fahrenheit, herbicide should still soak into the root system, should still take effect. It may not be quite as effective as it would be if you did it when it was above freezing, but it's still gonna get into the root system. Below 20 degrees, you're probably better off waiting until you've got a little warmer temperatures to work with. And I've known forestry crews to be doing forest stand improvement and invasives work pretty late into the winter. January, February, we still have some warm days where it gets above freezing during the day and doesn't get below 20 at night. I believe herbicide can still be effective in those situations.
Art, could you explain what Cut Stump is for those who may not know what it is?
Sure. Cut Stump is just cutting the invasive or any woody plant off at the ground, so as close to the soil line as you can, and then putting an herbicide on the phloem, which is the living part of the woody plant, the outside ring, so that herbicide can then soak into the root system. It'll soak into the cells and get down into the root system of the plant. That's basically what Cut Stump treatment is.
Awesome. Art, would you be willing to talk about the difference between an invasive plant and an aggressive plant, and maybe some examples of aggressive plants that are native?
Sure. So this is sort of a arbitrary definition, but to me, and I think most sources will probably agree with this, an invasive plant does not come from the local area that you're talking about. It's from another part of the world. So it has no place in the natural community, and it's aggressive. So examples are like we've been talking about. An example of a plant that is borderline, that could be invasive. Let's take common lilac for an example. It's not from the United States. I think it's from Europe or Asia. It does survive well here in Indiana. In fact, that's why it's a good landscaping plant. I have seen it spread a little bit, but it typically is not a problem. So in that case, we would not call lilac necessarily invasive because it's not spreading throughout our habitats. An aggressive species is a plant that is native to the local area, but just tends to have a growth pattern that crowds other things out, can be undesirable. An example of that would be poison ivy. Poison ivy is a native vine, native to our woodlands. It does have native wildlife habitat. A lot of songbirds eat the seeds. They are not affected by the poison ivy component of the plant. But poison ivy can be a pain, both because it's poisonous to our skin if we touch it, and also because it can vine up trees. It can affect the growth rate of native trees. It can get pretty thick and aggressive. Another example of an aggressive native plant is Canada goldenrod. Is native to Indiana. Oftentimes in old fields or CRP fields, Canada goldenrod will almost become a monoculture, crowd out the other wildflowers and natives. Canada goldenrod also supposedly has an allelopathic effect in its root system that can hinder the growth of native hardwoods. So in a lot of cases, Canada goldenrod is unwanted. Canada goldenrod does have some wildlife habitat value. It's great for pollinators in the fall. It puts out a lot of pollen and nectar, but it's just very aggressive, hard to control, but it's native. So that would be two examples of aggressive plants that that are not necessarily invasive, but they to you they might be a weed, and that's okay because they are hard to control.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. So Art, if you want to move on to the next slides, you're more than welcome to.
Okay, I'll jump presentations here. This next one is part of a general forestry presentation. A little more about the NRCS programs part of invasives. So we'll go into that and then probably take some questions. Okay, can you see that? Brush management?
Yes.
Okay. Brush management is one of our EQIP practices. It's an NRCS conservation practice targeted towards invasive woody species. Commonly, that's autumn olive, bush honeysuckle, multiflora rose, things like that. NRCS, if a landowner gets into EQIP, they can do brush management in their woods or open habitat for up to 3 years. Recommended methods of removal are anything greater than head height gets cut down at the soil and stump treated. Anything lower than head height can be foliar sprayed with an herbicide. And I just saw a question pop up about honeysuckle and autumn olive. How late can it be foliar sprayed? I've always heard until we get a hard killing frost, because those leaves of autumn olive and honeysuckle can hang on pretty far into the fall and remain green. As soon as those start to show yellowing, though, those leaves are dying, they're senescing, they're not going to uptake much herbicide anymore. So usually that's early mid-October or so. For around here, foliar application of herbicide can still be effective. We're quite a bit beyond that now for this year, but for future years, foliar herbicides can be applied pretty late into the fall. And then, so once the first year of brush management is done in an EQIP contract, the second year, the landowner or forestry crew or whoever's doing the work will come back in, and anything that they missed, anything that may have resprouted from roots or from new berries, we'll get a foliar application that's typically done with backpack sprayers. And then the same thing the third year. Third year, hopefully you're like in the 5 to 10% leaf area coverage range for the invasives. And that's pretty much just the crew walking the woods, spraying any invasives that they see, pretty light work, a lot easier than the first year of control. So that's how brush management works in our programs. It's becoming more and more popular, both from a wildlife habitat standpoint, because a lot of people we work with in these EQIP contracts are interested in wildlife habitat, and obviously getting the invasives out of your woods and replacing them if needed with something native is going to be good for wildlife habitat, but also because of the timber production standpoint. Even having just a 10% leaf area coverage presence of invasives in the understory of your woods can have a noticeable effect the growth rate of your crop trees. It can slow the growth of walnut down. It can slow the growth of red or white oak down. And those are your valuable timber trees. They're also your valuable wildlife habitat trees, producing the mast, the acorns, and the walnuts that a lot of the native wildlife species use. So on to the next one. Foresting improvement doesn't really deal with invasives. It can if they're at a light level. Foresting improvement is cutting some of the grapevines that might be too thick on your crop trees. The picture down in there on the left is actually a picture I took last summer in Steuben County of a CRP tree planting. We got a lot of calls last summer from people that started seeing damage on their trees in the summer, and most people thought it was gypsy moth. Well, come to find out, it was the 17-year cicadas. They caused quite a bit of damage to the young growth to trees, especially young oaks, and that's just it's just a natural part of the cycle here in Indiana. And the 17-year cicadas do a little bit of damage, and then they go away and they come back in 17 years. So that's what that ended up being. But to a lot of people, that looked like an invasive insect or disease coming in. Tree planting, not really related to invasives, but if you have a field, some of these old field settings get pretty choked up with autumn olive and multiflora rose and things. Once you get those species under control, unless you're going to farm that field, put it back into row crop agriculture, you need to put something there that's going to grow and outcompete those invasives. So that's where tree planting can come in. Planting a dense planting of trees, native hardwoods on an 8x8 or 8x10 spacing can get a good amount of tree canopy within 10-20 years. Start casting some shade and keep the invasives out of your field or your habitat. Some tree planting pictures. This is the other practice really related to invasives that NRCS gets involved in: herbaceous weed control, NRCS practice 315. It's basically the removal of unwanted herbaceous plants, mostly targeted at invasive species like Canada thistle, garlic mustard, reed canary grass. Oftentimes this involves spraying multiple times. It can involve mowing. The picture there in the middle is an old picture from Purdue. Did a study on the root systems and the spread of Canada thistle. I think that scale there is several feet deep. So that just gives you an idea of how aggressive the root system of Canada thistle can get. And now it makes sense looking at that, why if you spray a colony of Canada thistle, the next year it just may resprout, because it's got so much root reserves. It can take multiple years of control to kill that invasive plant. So and then wildlife habitat planting native things in place of invasives. Get something native growing there, keep the invasives out, and you'll have a good habitat into the future. Bottom right picture is a stand of prairie grass with a trail running through it in Steuben County. I took a couple falls ago. Picture on the left is a forb and native wildflower heavy planting on CRP in Steuben County. And then there's a couple nice pictures of other habitat in Steuben County that I've been involved with projects on. So that's really it for the NRCS program side of it. Any landowner interested in doing invasives control, getting the invasives off their property, I'd recommend they talk to their NRCS office, see what programs are available to help, because it can pay for the work. It can help pay for the herbicide, materials you might need to buy, such as saws, fuel for a chainsaw, things like that. It can really help with the expenses that go into invasives control.
Okay, thank you so much, Art, for your presentation. I know I learned a ton, and I'm sure everybody else did too. We have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. We do have a question from Phil saying for basil bark and stump cut, or basil bark, he has been using 50% crossbow and 50% crossbow, and he's wondering if he shouldn't use it even though it's working well.
That's a question I probably won't be able to give you a real good answer on, but if it's working for you, I'd say keep at it. The only thing I'd be cautious of is using that hot of a herbicide mix around native trees or plants that you do want to keep. Like I said, tulip tree tends to be one of the species that we see affected by herbicide quite a bit in Indiana. It seems to be pretty susceptible, mostly because it's got a pretty shallow, fleshy root system that seems to absorb a lot of chemicals really easily. But no, I would say if it's working for you and killing invasives, especially in a stump treatment, that should work. So.
Excuse me. That was my question. It was 50% crossbow and 50% fuel oil. And the reason for using that was you could do stump cut and also basil at the same time. It seems to be working, but I don't know if maybe I should reduce that or if environmentally it's a bad thing to do. We're using very little on each cut, but yeah, just was a question.
Okay, sure. Yep, that makes more sense. So the example I'll bring up is I know when working with ailanthus or tree of heaven, that mixture is often used as a basil bark treatment. Cutting tree of heaven, if you know anything about it, just basically produces a hydra effect. It's going to shoot up new shoots 25, 50 feet away from the tree that you cut, and you may not find them until a year or two later, and by then it may be several feet tall already and have its roots spreading another 20 feet. So in that case, a basil bark application of like you talked about is recommended for tree of heaven or ailanthus. And yes, I have heard of people having increased effectiveness, adding a little bit of fuel oil, diesel or something to get it to penetrate into the wood easier and get to the living part of the inner bark. I don't have a lot of personal experience with using it that way, but I know it works. Environmentally, I'm sure if you're using just a little bit on each tree, that's gonna, do what you want it to and decompose in the soil. A lot of herbicides are very soil specific or binding, meaning as soon as they touch the soil, they bind to the soil particles, and then natural processes break them down. So there's little risk of it getting further into the environment than that. But maybe somebody else could comment on that more. I'm not real confident on my answer there.
Okay, it looks like we have one question left. And it's from Cheryl saying, is all of this information on the SICM info site as far as the help with cost?
Yes, most of it's on that SICM info site, the landowner toolkit. The financial cost, they probably have general information on there about referring people to NRCS to talk about our programs. For that kind of information, the NRCS programs and the money for invasive species control, your best source would be to talk to your local NRCS person, your district conservationist for your county. I'm sure there's information further available online about that. Just look up the EQIP program, EQIP, NRCS Indiana. You'll probably find some good information about it. But yeah, definitely talk to if you're interested in that, definitely talk to your local NRCS person.
Okay, last chance for questions, comments.
This is Mariah, and you guys are all welcome to our weed wrangle on Saturday at 10 a.m. to learn how to identify and treat bush honeysuckle, privet, and buckthorn. The temperatures look like they've changed, so we should be able to still treat. It'll be in the mid-20s at 10 a.m. when we start.
Awesome. And Mariah, if you send me that information, I can send it out to everyone who registered for this event along with the recording.
Oh, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, I want to give a huge thank you to Art for giving such an amazing presentation. It's incredibly informative. I know I learned a lot. And also all of the questions were wonderful. So thank you all for joining. This is going to be our last coffee and webinar for the year. December is just hard for everyone because we're all just getting ready for the holidays. So we won't have one in December, and we'll start back up in February. So keep an eye on our website or our social media pages for the next coffee and. It seems like a lot of people were very interested in invasive species. So next year we might have another session on invasives since it seemed to be a very popular topic. But with that, I want to say a huge thank you to Art and everybody who joined us, and for the Allen Soil and Water Conservation District for making this event possible. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.